Thank you, Daisha. Thanks. I'll just go straight ahead and introduce our first speaker for today, who is William Patton, a PhD candidate in the history of art at the University of Aberdeen. William graduated from the University of Leeds before studying for 2 masters from the Universities of Warwick and Glasgow, and then spent 14 years working as a researcher at Christie's International Auction House. In 2014, he moved back to Aberdeen and began a part-time PhD investigating the career of James Byres, an 18th century tour guide and art dealer active in Rome, who retired from there to the cooler climes of Aberdeenshire. William's paper is titled "Sufficiently Provided for: James Byres and His West Indian Plantations." So William, I'll just hand it straight over to you.
Fantastic, thank you. And I will try and find my presentation. Has that worked? Can you see the presentation?
Yeah, you can see it.
Fantastic, thank you. This paper developed from my studies into the life and career of James Byres of Tonney, who was born in 1734 and died in 1817. Byres became one of the most successful art dealers in Rome during the heady heyday of the Grand Tour, quite the achievement considering he spent many of his formative years in France as the son of an exiled Aberdeenshire Jacobite. Byres' career was the product of a form of self-fashioning, as he managed to present himself as a reliable expert in a number of fields, sometimes basing his reputation on questionable credentials. This strategy underpinned his success. Byres was behind some formidable coups during his career. He sold what is now called the Portland vase to Sir William Hamilton, and he also sold Nicolas Poussin's celebrated 7 sacraments off the walls of a marquis's palace, smuggling them out of Rome, replacing each one with a copy so the papal authorities wouldn't discover the loss of their heritage. In addition, Byres was an architect. He's credited as the architect behind plans for a vast Italianate upgrade that was proposed for King's College here in Aberdeen in the late 18th century, a plan that with its grand domed, elaborate stonework, oggies and curlicues would have required a lot more than the £400 budgeted for the works at the time. For his friend Eliza Fraser of Castle Fraser, he also designed one of the finest mausolea in Aberdeenshire. Much of Byres' art market career was propelled in the beginning by a really efficient, rigorous use of trust networks, beginning with his family. Byres' ascent is noteworthy as he was the son of an exiled Jacobite, Patrick Byres, shown in the middle here. He was raised in part in France and was in the army there, moving to Rome in his mid-20s. To the Brits abroad, who were his most frequent clients, he embodied several notions of other. He was the son of a former outlaw, he was a convert to Catholicism, and he was plausibly gay, living with his partner Christopher Norton, shown here on the right. When authors have discussed Byres, a number have pointed to the way that he managed to use different aspects of his career as an artist, an architect, an author, a tour guide, a designer, a banker, the one to feed the other. Paulo Cohen referred to this in a translation by the Etruscologist David Ridgway as a virtuous circle. However, in the course of my research, it became increasingly apparent that Byres' circle was not entirely virtuous. Among many honest transactions, he also dealt in smuggled objects, modern counterfeits, and misattributed paintings. And, in addition, he had links, strong links, to plantations in the Caribbean. Byres initially became linked to slavery through the sustained efforts of his family in a pattern that echoed that of his professional career. To this end, it's worthwhile looking at a family tree. It shows, it's probably too small on many screens, sorry. It shows that Byres was linked to several local landed families like the Moyers of Stonywood and the Gordons of Hall Head. These were families like Byres' own, which straddled the world of the merchant with that of the laird. Interestingly, Byres' great-uncle was one of the architects of the ill-fated Dorian scheme, an early and disastrous Scottish colonial adventure or misadventure in the Caribbean. Now I want to look at Byres' own generation. He was one of 7 siblings, with 3 brothers and 3 sisters. The sisters married respectively a lawyer, a merchant, and a minister. Byres, as I've mentioned, was largely raised in France and in foreign service. By contrast, 2 of his brothers became colonial surveyors and the other a merchant who also served as a local consul on the Baltic. This reflects the way that many families, in the wake of the Jacobite uprisings, navigated Scottishness and Britishness. Byres was very much out of the establishment, although he guided establishment figures around Rome and sold them artworks. By contrast, his brothers were advantageously absorbed into the machinery of the British state. I say advantageously because there was a very specific upside for the family in the surveying done first by William and later by John. This is clearly evidenced by the deed books relating to St Vincent, which have been digitised as part of the Endangered Archive project under the auspices of the British Library. In one of these, a map shows a portion of land being divided between two French planters. Crucially, the land above it had been purchased by William Byres. His name was also listed as an early owner of a plot on Dominica. William died in his early 20s in St Vincent. The fact that John Byres was a surveyor there a few years later probably reflects the mechanics of patronage of the day and may have been the result of family members pushing for the position. John was soon in a more elevated role than William. He became the chief surveyor for the area, charting a number of territories. This was in part with a view to helping to populate the islands, as they said, at the expense, obviously, of the indigenous populations. Land was laid aside for the Caribs, but in ever-decreasing portions. Meanwhile, token gestures were made to respecting their legal status, with a grant of annuity being made from John Byres himself to Mary Charlotte Ahuyaka, a Caribess, in 1778 in respect to a land transaction. However, this was quite simply a displacement and an erasure of the indigenous culture, which was echoed in miniature when John Byres combined his position of authority with a nostalgic prejudice towards Aberdeenshire by attempting to rename the River Yambu as the River Don. The name didn't stick. John Byres took advantage of his position to acquire a number of parcels of land across a range of islands, in some cases flipping them swiftly. Similarly, John helped secure land for James Byres himself, who in 1777 was listed as the owner of two estates totaling over 400 acres. As can be seen in this slide, John subdivided at least one of his holdings, leasing small areas to a number of French planters. In other cases, he leased and mortgaged his estates, gaining funds through these routes. However, his involvement with the plantation economy was clearly not entirely arm's length. As early as 1767, the Freeport Gazette said that Byres was offering a reward to anyone who apprehended and returned Sammy, a Creole of Antigua, dressed when he ran away in a brown thick-set frock, blue breeches and black stockings, had a pair of large buckles in his shoes, a flapped hat with a white metal button in it, and had received a fresh wound in the crown of his head. When John Byres died in 1788, he had numerous debts. However, the estates he had owned in the West Indies meant that he was ultimately wealthy. When James Byres wrote his own will, he left large sums to his nieces Isabella and Janet, the daughters of his merchant brother Robert. By contrast to John's daughters, he bequeathed £50 sterling, which I leave to them as a small mark of my love and affection, they being already sufficiently provided for. The family was continuing to benefit from their plantations. But papers relating to Byres' Caribbean affairs after John's departure show that some of the land acquisitions had been on behalf of their Jacobite father, as well as three of the four brothers. It was, as we're seeing today and tomorrow, a common trajectory, a get-rich scheme favoured by numerous landowners in Scotland, an arrangement that meant that society out there was also rather cosy and incestuous for those blessed with the right background. It was also a great place for flushing away scandals and hoping that if they bounced back, they would bounce back profitably. Two of these attempts were made by the Byres family. First, Robert Byres, the merchant who played an increasing role in his brother James's banker, was bankrupted himself. Robert had managed significant sums for his brother, including the money paid by the Duke of Rutland for the 7 sacraments mentioned earlier. In the wake of Robert's financial collapse, Byres was thus a serious loser, and also found himself very much his brother's keeper. Robert lived in his brother's house for years before being sent out to the West Indies, with a letter giving him power of attorney over James's affairs, as well as those of their late brother John. Robert arrived in 1799, lodging the letter in St Vincent in October that year, and dying the following month. Some years later, a similar trajectory was taken by Byres' brother-in-law, John Durno, an Aberdeen-based advocate. He had been a man of business for a number of local estates and was very well connected. His brother, James Durno, had also been Robert Byres' business partner in the Baltic. James Durno would become the British consul in Memel, like Robert, but would then be knighted and become an eminent personage. John Durno tried to use his brother-in-law James Byres, and also connections with the Fergusons of Putfur to jostle for a lucrative position that would allow him to repay debts which he'd accumulated and which went disastrously for him. At the height of his desperation, he even appears to have tried to swindle James Byres out of one of the estates. In this case, Byres was buying back the rights to a mortgage on one of the estates that had been bought by John Byres, but with funds supplied apparently by their father Patrick. Durno was asked to carry out the transaction, but entered his own name in the documents. Byres, nonetheless, provided tireless support for Durno, who was eventually sent out to the Caribbean in 1806, where he became Controller of Customs in Jamaica. Although he appears to have struggled to repay his debts, he was keenly aware of his obligations, eventually sending a turtle back to Tonley. He ultimately died out there, although he is memorialised on a family stone in the St Nicholas Kirkyard in Aberdeen. In a sense, these connections show that even at the time there was a lingering perception that things were at best a tad unseemly in the West Indies, that there was some moral hinterland there. It was a place of opportunity, but these opportunities were only financially redemptive. Much of the interest was focused on greed and on the desire to make money. Byres didn't visit his plantations and seems often to have tried to get rid of them. Nonetheless, he invested capital in them and doubtless received revenue. Byres cannot have been oblivious to the human cost of slavery. He was a friend and tangential relation of the philosopher and historian Adam Ferguson, who prominently denounced slavery. After Byres retired to Tonley, his Aberdeenshire estate, in 1790, he appears to have been more actively involved in the administration of the West Indian properties. But during that time, he must have been aware of Dr. Beattie's efforts towards abolition from Aberdeen, not least as they were mutual friends of the banker Sir William Forbes of Pitsligo. Durno's letters to his wife show a great tenderness and affection, but contain occasional details of the grim realities of life in Jamaica. These letters may well have been shown to her brother Byres. Byres himself, earlier in his career, had written a draft history of the ancient state of Italy. In it, he showed a sensitivity to the plight of the ancient Etruscans that may have been informed by his own Jacobite background. He was conscious of their suffering the Roman yoke.
William.
Sure. Yet he appears to have been oblivious to the shackles of the enslaved people on his own plantations. When John Byres died, their brother-in-law, Dr. George Moyer, a minister in Peterhead, refused to serve as executor, perhaps reflecting his own unease with slavery. Neither James nor John Byres deigned to mention their West Indian properties in their wills, unlike some of their contemporaries. William Fraser, for instance, with whom John Byres had entered into his mortgage, insisted that 2 of his named slaves be freed and that the rest be sold to such masters as they themselves may choose, insisting that this was his will and my warmest request, that they be found good masters. Both Byres and his brother appear all the more callous by comparison. I've written and deleted lots of conclusions for this paper, and even during the course of today, maybe particularly during the course of today, it's difficult to conclude with this sort of material. After all, Britain's involvement with slavery implicated almost everyone, as Dr. McKillop has said. In late 18th century Europe, if you served in the military, wore cotton, had mahogany furniture, or sweetened your tea, you were implicated to some degree or another in the slavery economy. Looking at the Portland vase, should we see in it the additional taint of association with Byres and thence with slavery? He profited from the traffic of chattels, both inanimate and animate. Many of the inanimate chattels, some of which I've illustrated today, are now in prestigious museum collections throughout the world. This conference highlights and corrects the way that history and art history have been recorded and received, so that, apart from a few souls, such as the Bleeding Sammy, the animate chattels of the Byres family remain largely undocumented and nameless. That's me. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for a really interesting paper. I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions at the end of the session. Can I just ask you to stop sharing your slides? Great, thanks, thank you. Okay, so now on to our, I can still see your screen, William. Yeah, that's it, thanks. Okay, I'll just introduce our second speaker for the session now, who's Rory Lam. Rory is a second-year PhD researcher in the Department of Architectural History at the University of Edinburgh. His doctoral studies investigate the residences of Scots in London in the 18th century, how these related to town and country houses in Scotland, and what role architecture might play in forming Scottish identity in the capital. He's previously worked as a heritage consultant in Belfast, and his interests include the Scottish diaspora, national identities in 18th century Britain, and more generally British architectural history, focusing on the early modern period. Rory's paper is entitled Designing for Colonial Wealth in North East Scotland, James Playfair at Dunninald, Urie and Cairness. Thank you, Rory. I'll just hand over to you.
Great. Can you hear me and see the screen?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Can I move the screen is another question. Maybe I'll do it this way. To establish colonial connections in the career of the Scottish architect James Playfair, we need look no further than his most influential patron, Henry Dundas, whose role in delaying the abolition of slavery has received much discussion. As chairman of the Board of Control, Dundas was instrumental in determining British policy in India and was emblematic of Scottish propensity to benefit from the empire. In 1785, Dundas was gaining prominence at Westminster and rebuilt his country seat in the constituency of Mid Lothian to designs by the young Playfair. Melville Castle, on screen, was itself a property founded on the wealth Dundas's father-in-law, David Ranney, had amassed from the East India Company. This funded Playfair's simple but elegant mansion, which he later advertised as the benchmark of fashionable metropolitan taste and quality to Scottish patrons. Dundas's continuing support would be crucial in expanding Playfair's list of Scottish clients in London. Now, Midlothian, of course, falls outside of the scope of our conference today, but Melville is a good example to set the scene in that colonial wealth is funding Playfair's architectural designs and attempts to bring London fashions to Scotland. I want to take this idea further by examining three of his projects in the northeast, at Urie, Dunninald and Cairness, to place London as the centre of a network of colonial imports and architectural fashion. Born near Dundee, Playfair settled in Bloomsbury around 1780, and by his premature death in 1794, had an impressive list of Scottish clients. His correspondence suggests that this was not a failure to break through to English clientele, but a conscious business decision. From the completion of his first major project at Melville, Playfair was advertising himself with the claim that, as a fashionable London architect, he could orchestrate the delivery to Scotland of the latest metropolitan styles, quality craftsmanship, and ideas for estate improvement. This dynamic prompted his intention that the English craftsmen who had built Melville should be recommended at all of his projects in Scotland. He wrote of his foreman, James Hurd, quote, "He has with him a chosen set of the best workmen that London affords as joiners, plasterers and painters. Melville Castle is a specimen of the most excellent work done by those men and the prices of it. Disseminating their craftsmanship was part of a broader Anglicising programme, including improving the Scottish building trade through the training of craftsmen, importing technical advances in construction and materials, and new aesthetic ideas such as French neoclassicism. Ultimately, Playfair hoped to move his office to Edinburgh alongside a warehouse of imported English specimens of windows, doors, and chimney pieces, and so on, a project cut short by his early death. This dynamic of reciprocal movement between London and Scotland lies behind our three projects. The first of these is Yuri House near Stonehaven, the home of the Berkeley family from the 1660s to 1850s. Playfair was employed here by Robert Berkeley Allardyce, the fifth laird of Urie, who entered Parliament for Kincardineshire in 1788 with Dundas's patronage. Berkeley was a noted agricultural improver, remembered for consolidating his estates, introducing English farming methods and crops, and redeveloping Stonehaven. The Urie Berkeleys were prominent Quakers, and the MP's great-grandfather, Robert, was celebrated for his apology in defence of their religion, and was also a friend of William Penn. In 1683, this Robert Berkeley established the family's lengthy association with North America when he was appointed as governor of East Jersey, with a generous share of the land there to allocate to colonists. Although he never visited the colony, one of his sons used the connection to become a merchant there in Philadelphia. More relevant to us, however, is another son, David, who moved to London around 1690. He was apprenticed to a glover called John Taylor, entered the Drapers' Company, and died in 1769 as one of the richest merchants in London, with a fortune of £100,000. He had married Taylor's daughter and inherited his mansion opposite St Mary le Bow in Cheapside. David's business centred on exporting linen to North America, and his firm owned ships trading to New York, Pennsylvania, the Chesapeake, and the West Indies. His sons helped establish the bank, surviving today as Barclays plc. And these sons redirected the family interests into brewing and banking when the American Revolution threatened their trade abroad. One of these sons, David Berkeley of Youngsbury, worked with other American merchants to attempt to divert the revolution, and later championed the Quaker abolitionist movement. He famously manumitted an estate of slaves, enslaved people in Jamaica in 1794, resettling them in America. By the late 18th century, then, the London Berkeleys were beginning to eclipse the lairds back in Urie, both financially and in social standing. For David Berkeley Sr. had hosted the royal family in Cheapside in 1761, as shown on screen. Playfair's alterations at Urie were commissioned by Robert Berkeley Allardyce in 1787, perhaps as the laird's attempt to parallel this mercantile success. There were close ties to London, especially after 1756, when Robert had married his cousin Lucy, the daughter of David Berkeley of Cheapside. Although Lucy died the next year, the brief marriage reinforces the connections between Urie, London, and the colonies. David Berkeley's will suggests further financial links, recording money left to Robert Berkeley at Urie, and more to be distributed by him to poor Quakers in Aberdeenshire and to the Aberdeen Infirmary. Interest in family genealogy had already moved the London merchant to finance a mausoleum for his Quaker forebears at the family home. This concern with genealogy seems to have been shared by Berkeley Allardyce, for Playfair experimented in his designs with ways to retain the existing Urie castle, and the architect himself felt that the picturesque situation there, quote, is such as to require whatever is done to be in the style of a castle, such is required by the character of the place. Given that the existing house had only been built in 1670 and was of no great architectural pretensions, its retention suggests that the laird's desire to aggrandise the family heritage architecturally as the London merchants had done financially. It was also tied up with Berkeley's second marriage, through which he unsuccessfully laid claim to a defunct earldom and also, of course, entered Parliament in 1788. So his optimism about his growth of social standing perhaps lies behind a more assertive scheme for Urie, where Playfair proposes a more grand neoclassical house on a fresh site nearby. Use of architecture to reflect new social standing is also found in Playfair's work for David Scott of Dunninald. Here drawing more directly on colonial wealth. Scott fits a common typology of Scottish colonial activity in the 18th century. A younger son of an impoverished Angus estate, he left for India in 1763 as a free merchant and spent 23 years in Bombay, commanding a respected agency house. Alongside financial success, Scott achieved their social prominence, financing the colonial government and being the leader of the free merchants in India. In 1786, Scott returned to direct his business from London, and he befriended Henry Dundas, who helped him into a directorship of the East India Company in 1788, and then into Parliament for Forfarshire in 1790. Scott and Dundas shared similar desires for reform of the East India Company to increase free trade and for imperial expansion in India. With his activities then firmly centred in London, on the one hand, Scott had to navigate conservative mercantile circles in the company and became the leader of a so-called new shipping interest, campaigning for reductions in duties on India goods and the widening of access to shipbuilding contracts. On the other, 1790s saw increasing reliance on him advising Pitt and Dundas on India affairs in London. Scott's knowledge of operation of trade and politics in India was invaluable, and the rapid intel of an overland express communication financed by his company made him the first to be informed of developments in India. Political office in London was one inspiration behind Scott's investment around his estate of Dunninald, near Arbroath, which he purchased from his brother Archibald on return from India in 1786. He donated chandeliers to the new county buildings in Forfar, incidentally one of Playfair's first public commissions. This portrait on screen still hangs in that building. He established salt works at the village of Euston, financed new roads, and joined Berkeley and Dundas to repeal a crippling duty on coal on the east coast in 1793. As Dundas's lieutenant in London, it was likely he who recommended Playfair to Scott to project an architectural presence in his constituency. Like at Urie, Playfair mused over incorporating service spaces into the plan of the country house, and here resorts to a novel solution of a fully enclosed forecourt entered laterally through barrel-vaulted archways. The style anticipates the simplicity of Playfair's later work, with stripped-back classical forms and rustication, but retaining a clearly triumphal character, which is best seen in a cleverly configured gate lodge, which is modelled on a triumphal arch. It's tempting to see in the courtyard arrangement and sober classicism something of the colonial public buildings Scott would have known in India, highlighting perhaps the similarity of his attitude to improvement in industry in India and Scotland. He also made investment into planning a new settlement from Playfair nearby at Budden Point, and here there is an overt colonial connection with the market hall modelled on a pagoda. The Dunninald project was scuppered in the end by Scott's very preoccupation with London, his political commitments and increasing conflicts with the East India Company draining his health and finances in the 1790s and diverting his attention from the schemes. However, both of the previous two projects show that there is a strong connection in these works of Playfair between architecture, estate improvement in Scotland, and colonial wealth from London. And this is best seen in Playfair's celebrated house at Cairness near Fraserburgh. And for David Walker and Colin McWilliam, this house, quote, reveals the elder Playfair as perhaps the most advanced British architect of his generation. Primarily for its neoclassical design. See the progression of Playfair's experiments with the arrangement of the outbuildings, here grouped into an efficient semicircle, which recalls in form and typology the work of French neoclassicists. Cairness was erected using English craftsmen supervising local builders, while other carpenters, joiners and bricklayers were sent from London. Materials like chimney pieces, panelling and plasterwork were manufactured in London and shipped north. Walker and William comment on the, quote, uncommon excellence of its construction and the intricate detailing and fine finishing. An English landscape gardener was also engaged to lay out the gardens and furniture bought from Seddons in London in 1794. Cairness was commissioned by Charles Gordon of Buffalo, a Scotsman who had inherited plantations and enslaved people in Jamaica. It's assumed that the house was funded from the proceeds of sugar from an estate called Georgia in Jamaica, given to him in 1779 by John Grant of Kilgraston. Among Gordon's papers are letters detailing the channels of finance from Jamaica to London to Scotland. At Grant's recommendation in 1782, Gordon appointed the London merchants Stephen and Rose Fuller to conduct his affairs. The Fullers administered the import of cargoes of sugar, advised Gordon on the British sugar market, processed the sales and acted as his bankers. One letter from the 21st of June 1791 shows that they also paid James Playfair's bills for Cairness, highlighting the role of London in receiving and transforming colonial wealth before it had even reached Aberdeenshire. As Stephen Fuller was the London agent to the Jamaican Assembly, he kept Gordon abreast of news on the bills for abolition as well. Fuller and others in Gordon's circle were among those in the pro-slavery camp seeking to legislate modest improvements to the treatment of enslaved people to thereby deflect wider criticism of the trade. To conclude then, we have seen that Playfair's commissions at Urie, Dunninald and Cairness, among others in the rest of Scotland, rested on associations with colonial funding. Each indicates the importance of London and the financial world behind them, either, both as the hub by which wealth arrived in Britain and the place of fashion from which Playfair could sell himself as an improving architect. As with many of Playfair's projects, Urie and Dunninald lay on the drawing board when he died in 1794. But all three projects testify to the power of colonial wealth in fueling architectural ambition. Finally, though, Cairness remains the exemplar here as the one which was built and survives today, where we can trace the close links between the proceeds of West Indian sugar imports in London, the commissioning there of innovative architectural designs, and via the mechanisms of Playfair's cross-border practice, the arrival and execution of these improvements in the distant northeast corner of Aberdeenshire. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Again, could you just stop your screen time as well? Great. Thank you very much, and thank you for a rich and interesting paper. I'll move straight on to our final speaker of the day now, Dr. David Alston. David is a freelance historian and author from the Highlands, who has been a youth worker in Toxteth in Liverpool, a school teacher in Wallsend and Tyneside, an adult education organiser in the Highlands, a museum curator, a local authority councillor, and a chair of an NHS board. For 20 years, he has been researching the role of Northern Scots in the slave work plantations of the Caribbean, especially Guyana. And he's among the first Scottish historians to address the issue of Scotland's involvement with slavery. His paper today is titled The Cruikshanks of Gorton, Strathspey, and St Vincent Legacies of Slavery and Ethnic Cleansing. I'll just hand over to you now, David. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I start my talk with this magnificent pair of paintings by Raeburn of James Cruikshank and Mrs. Cruikshank. Mrs. Cruikshank is Margaret Gerard. Her father was Professor of Greek at Aberdeen University, I think was one of the figures that appeared in the caricature that Thomas showed earlier. And one of her sisters married one of the other Cruikshank brothers. Next slide. Next slide. And this is where they come from, Gorton, up above Granton-on-Spey. There are people, a family who would have described themselves as tacksmen, as principal tenants. But this is upland farming. They've got status, but they don't have a great deal of wealth. There's a very helpful pedigree of the family that was digitized by Aberdeen City Museums quite some time ago. And from that, we can see what happens to the children. They don't go into the professions. A lot of them become artisans, particularly carpenters. Next slide, please. And they're able to rise in the world socially and financially through their involvement in St Vincent, which is one of the islands ceded to Britain in 1763. Next slide, please. This is the Byres map shown earlier, and they're involved in the north of the island in the parish of St David's. I'll come back to that map a little bit later on. Next slide, please. It's interesting that there is another family there that they know of similar status, the Frasers of Bublani near Inverness. And there's quite an extensive correspondence from a number of the Fraser families, particularly from Thomas Fraser, who is involved in St Vincent. They're also a family who would have described themselves as tacksmen, and Thomas Fraser is also a carpenter. They know each other well enough that sometimes on this occasion he's sitting beside James Cruikshank, who's writing to his brother, and that's they're probably sitting at Chateau Belair in the north of the island. And they share the cost of the postage. They send the letters together to Gorton, and then Thomas Fraser's letter is sent on to Inverness, and they pay the cost of that. Next slide, please. But the difference between them is that the Cruikshanks make it, they rise in the world, the Frasers don't. And here James Cruikshank is about to go home. He's bought an estate for £33,000, which he hopes to pay off in 7 years. And after that, it's going to give him an income shared with his brother, one of his brothers, of £3,000 a year. And Thomas Fraser's comment on this, I think, is interesting because he says it is well for some people their friends were here before them. Otherwise, they might be toiling and working for other people to this good day as I am. And that's how Thomas sees his position. He hasn't had the connections, he hadn't had the friends there before him to enable him to rise in the world in the way that the Cruikshanks have done. Next slide, please. Going back to that map of St Vincent, both these families are in the parish of St David. And as was shown earlier on these maps of Byres, one of the things which this map is produced after the first Carib War, that between 1769 and 1773, there is a prolonged war with the indigenous Carib people. Their name for themselves then, and well, certainly now, and I think then would have been the Garifuna, which is concluded by a peace treaty entered into with the Carib chief Chatoyer, and lines are drawn on the map at that point. That red line crossing the map is the map which separates the Carib lands to the north to the settled lands which have gone to largely British settlers in the south. And that's significant for what happens to both these families. Next slide, please. One of the bones of contention was that there had already, by the time that map was drawn, been incursions into the Carib lands by Colonel Etherington, who was the commander of British forces in St Vincent. He claimed to have been leased land by the Carib chief Chatoyer. Chatoyer and his brothers said that they had simply granted him a small area of land. This is the portrait of Etherington, and I think it's fascinating that as a British soldier and commander of the British troops in St Vincent, he's sitting there surrounded, I think, by bundles of sugarcane, which is where the wealth comes from. Next slide, please. And it was that incursion which encouraged Chatoyer, shown here in a portrait painted by Augustina Bunias, who's very much the official artist of the British settlement of St Vincent. Next slide, please. Chatoyer initiates the Second Carib War in 1795. Now, I think you can see the rise of Scots in St Vincent through the colony militia. There are very few Scots in the initial grants of land, large grants of land to settlers. But by 1773, a third of the officers of the militia are Scots. And in 1795, during this Second Carib War, they embody a code of 500 armed enslaved people. And that's commanded by white officers, half of the 20 officers Scots, and that includes a major and 3 of the 4 captains. So I think you can see the way in there where the Scots who are in St Vincent, there's also a pattern there of rising in the world from being poor settlers to being very much the people who are operating this or playing a disproportionate role in operating the system on the island. The people who fight against Chatoyer, and he has risen up and he's joined with enslaved people and with French revolutionary forces who have swept south through the island. Next slide, please. Chatoyer captures a number of people at Chateau Belair in the parish of St David, which I showed in the earlier map, and then goes south. And he executes a number of the prisoners who include a Duncan Cruikshank, a Peter Cruikshank, and an Alexander Grant. I don't know if these Cruikshanks are related to James Cruikshank, but they're certainly been taken from the same area. And then I think it's the next day Chatoyer is killed. In some senses, the war could be said to end in 1797, but there is still resistance from the Caribs until, but in 1797, a major step is taken in what I think we can legitimately call ethnic cleansing. The British take the decision to round up and deport the vast majority of the Carib population. Almost 4,500 are gathered together, most of them women and children, about 1,000 men, but 3,300 women and children. And they're taken to a tiny island, Ballycoe, where they're kept for about 2 months before British ships arrive to transport them to the island of Roatan off Honduras. And during that 2-month period, about half of them die. The remainder are transported, and the Garifuna, the Caribs, are still in Honduras and in some other places. Their land is then finally divided. That land at the north of the map is divided in 1804. And I think you can see from that slide the extent to which people like the Cruikshanks benefit, and also a number of other people from the north of Scotland, including Robert Sutherland of Uppit in Sutherland. And I think that there's been quite a bit in the chat about Sutherlands, and I think this may be where the name is coming from. Next slide, please. And there are the Honduran Garifuna who are still struggling for land rights in Honduras. There's also a significant Garifuna population in New York, and I do wonder what they make if they know of the fact that James Cruikshank's portrait, who's one of those involved in this whose family is involved in this ethnic cleansing, it hangs in the Frick Museum. Next slide, please. The Cruikshanks returned to Scotland. They have risen in the world. They've made money. This is Langley Park near Fortrose, which is one of their houses. And the next slide, please. And this is Stracathro near Brechin. There's another connection here to the University of Aberdeen, because this was built for James Cruikshank to designs which had already been put forward for a replacement for Marshall College in Aberdeen, and designs which weren't used and which were adapted for this house. Next slide, please. So that's another one of Stracathro. The next slide. And I've really, I think, made 2 points so far. One is that the Cruikshanks of Gorton are a family who rise in the world from being middling rank tacksmen and tradesmen to being among the richest of the people who've made money in the Caribbean. The second point was that they've made that not just through the exploitation of enslaved Africans, but through the ethnic cleansing of the significant native population of St Vincent. The third point is this, that Thomas Fraser from that family didn't make it. There's some very insightful comments in his letters. And one of them is this, he says to his friend in Inverness, who is saying the same thing about people he sees becoming involved in the Caribbean, particularly by that point in Demerara. He says, you've only seen the fortunate few and draw your conclusion accordingly. Now, in the modern discipline of behavioral economics, which is the study of how people actually make decisions, rather than the classical economic model that people rationally weigh advantages and disadvantages, there is something called the availability heuristic, which is a systematic bias in human thought. And that means all of our thought. The way we think about things depends on how readily we can call examples to mind. And according to the heuristic, the availability heuristic, if we can readily draw to mind an example of something, we overestimate its probability. So if people are thinking of, how likely is it if I go to the Caribbean, if I go to St Vincent, that I will be successful, that will be influenced by how readily they can bring to mind examples of people who have been successful. And I think that return to Scotland, that display of wealth in buildings, in art, is done to display wealth, but it also, I suspect, has that function of leading people to overestimate the chances of success and drawing more people to these adventures abroad in the Caribbean, which at the end of the day were based on the exploitation of enslaved Africans, and in this case at least, in the ethnic cleansing of indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much for a very thought-provoking and informative paper. I'm sure everybody are going to have lots of questions after this panel. What I'll do is just ask you to pop your questions in the chat, and then you can either unmute yourself and ask your question, or if you prefer, we can read it out for you. Okay, just I'll get us started while I'm waiting for some questions to give people time to think of some questions. I was very, very interested in the idea of the display of wealth, and really what you were saying about the Portland vase and the different stories that these objects might potentially tell. And I was just wondering, a question to all three speakers. Where do we go from here? What do we do with this knowledge? And how can the art objects and architecture that you're speaking about, how can that maybe be used to tell new stories and to carry this knowledge forward? So just a question to all three of you. I'll open that up.
I think that it's a very interesting question. It's one that lots of people are struggling with, I think, at the moment. You have Oliver Dowden usefully dipping his oar into it down in England, and all these, at least north of the border, we're slightly exempted from some of the supposed woke wars. But I think, knowledge, you need it for better and for worse, just to be able to understand the culture that's emerged. And when we look at these things, we're looking at the similarities as well as the differences. The things that you need the reminders that it's not that difficult to be the frog in ever increasingly hot water that suddenly goes from being having a good time to being in a terrible position. I think, it's that moral slide that is always there with some of and these objects can be reminders to us of that.
I think that people relate to the lives of individuals. And I think the example that Richard Anderson gave earlier of the artwork near the Powys Gates, which incorporated what had been recovered of the life of an individual enslaved woman, can be a very powerful way of presenting the information. It's not easy to do because the records are so biased towards the enslavers, but it is possible. I think probably in some former colonies more than others, but it can be done, and I think that's a powerful tool.
The another kind of interesting aspect of that I've come across, was specifically thinking about this property at Cairness, is the idea that this remains a privately owned house, but is now owned by totally different owners who are not related to the original Gordons of Buccleuch. And there's obviously an even trickier question of how interpretation of a place can be made when there's not a public body governing how a site is being looked after. But in that particular case, I think there's an interesting thing where there's revealing the very sort of dramatic flip side of these aspects of heritage. And when we talk about distinctions between tangible and intangible heritage, and in the case of Cairness, the narrative is not, I suppose it has been excluding the sort of connections to colonies and slavery and so on, but the focus has been on something completely different, which has been its justifiable celebration for its architectural significance, for the connection with Playfair, many of whose buildings were never built as a revolutionary building in the style of neoclassicism at the time. And so it's then saying, well, look, we've got all of these fascinating things to do with design and architecture and so on. On the flip side of that, we've got these other narratives that are more to do with the financing, the ownership and so on, that are as relevant to our interest in the property, but for different reasons.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Going to move on now. We have a question from Wendy, not me, another Wendy.
Yes, thank you. This is for Rory Lam. I just have a question about something you said. You said that David Barclay manumitted his enslaved population in Jamaica and then sent them to the US. But that sounds like going from the frying pan into the fire. Or where did they go? Like,
so I haven't read the full details of this, but what I believe the story is that it was an experiment on a particular estate of enslaved people. I forget the number. It was under 100 people, I believe, and they were sent by Barclay from the West Indies to mainland America into an organization led by Quaker abolitionists who trained the people in practical trades and so on, so that they could then go out into, well, I don't know what happened to any of them, but with the idea that they could then go out as freed people into society with technical skills that they could use.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and we also have a question from Alison.
This is a question for David. It's about the Indigenous population on St Vincent, and I wondered if you were aware of work by Melanie Newton in Toronto. She ties the difference between the Indigenous population in the Caribbean, and she compares that to the situation of Indigenous populations elsewhere, like in Canada, who at the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, there was a declaration by George III that gave those Canadian Indigenous people some rights in law, but failed to recognise that there was an indigenous population at all in the Caribbean islands. So I think that's got something to do with the root of how the authorities were able to infiltrate their, supposed the lands that were given to indigenous.
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm not aware of that work, and I would be interested in it. And I think there was an argument. I don't know what the correct answer is here, but I think there are different views about the extent to which the Garifuna were a mixture of indigenous people and formerly enslaved people, and certainly it's by describing them as the Black Caribs and emphasising the extent to which they were, at least in part, the descendants of enslaved Africans. One of the effects of that was to water down the idea that they were an indigenous people, and I think that may have made it easier to encroach on the lands.
Yes, I think that's right. The so-called yellow Caribs were separated and moved back to St Vincent. They didn't get sent to Honduras, but so yes. I don't know enough about that, and it will be and I don't know what the Garifuna themselves would take to be their heritage.
I see that David has got more comments in the chat as well about this.
I was just going to say that I think it's important to see the treatment of them in that kind of wider view, rather than just a few planters going to the island. There's a sort of whole legal framework behind what was happening.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've got time just for one more question. So, Alessandra, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, perfect.
Hi. This is a question that I also put in the chat, and what I want to know is, as an art historian, how do you contribute to the current debate on returning this accumulation of wealth that was made and accumulated at the expenses of the colonized and the dispossessed? And what do you think are the ethical implications in approaching this history and also this current debate? Thank you.
From the art historical perspective, I think my advantage is that I deal with, I've been investigating James Byres for deep feedback. Sorry. And so even though he was involved with slavery, he was usually only the middleman. But it's a fascinating question. I'm glad not to be in the position to have to actually answer it with many actions. I think I can contribute information that would lead other people to reach conclusions, but I've failed dismally to reach any conclusions on that point myself. I think when you have something like the Benin head that Aberdeen University is returning to Nigeria, that's quite a clear-cut example where they can do that very easily. But where you're talking about colonial connections, it's difficult to look at something like a Rayburn portrait of someone who had plantations, who paid for the portrait with plantation wealth, using the productivity of enslaved laborers, and work out how you would cut that picture up in such a way as to make reparations in some way. Wendy, you're on mute. You're back on mute.
Thank you. Okay, unless anyone else has any further comments they want to make in response to that question, I think we're actually out of time.